Silas Vane was a man who lived by coordinates. As a high-end estate liquidator in New England, he specialized in difficult properties, houses that people wanted to forget. He was cold, logical, and didn't believe in ghosts. One autumn evening, Silas was clearing out the attic of a secluded manor belonging to the late Arthur Penhaligon, a recluse who had spent 40 years obsessed with impossible topographies. In a hidden compartment of a heavy oak desk, Silas found a tube of aged vellum. Inside was a map of the very town Silas lived in, Blackwood Falls. But the map was wrong. There were streets Silas had never seen, parks where there should be buildings, and a massive cathedral at the center of the town that simply did not exist. At the bottom of the vellum, a note was scribbled in frantic, jagged handwriting. "The ink is hungry. Do not let it touch your skin. Once you see the paths see you." As Silas unrolled the map further, he noticed something impossible. The ink lines were moving. A small, black river on the vellum was slowly flowing across the page. A street labeled Whistleway was shrinking while another, Lament Lane, was growing longer. Suddenly, a drop of the thick, oily ink dripped from the edge of the vellum and landed on Silas's forearm. He tried to wipe it off, but the ink didn't smear. It sank into his pores. A sharp, searing heat radiated through his arm. Beneath his skin, Silas watched in horror as the black ink began to form a perfect, microscopic street map on his flesh. It wasn't just a tattoo. He could feel the traffic of his own blood pumping through the drawn veins. Then his phone buzzed. It was a GPS notification. "Destination updated. You are now on Whistleway." Silas looked out the window. His car was still parked in the driveway, but the driveway was no longer gravel. It was paved in black, obsidian-like stone that hadn't been there a minute ago. The trees had moved closer to the house. The town of Blackwood Falls was rewriting itself around him, following the map on his arm. A low, vibrating hum began to emanate from the walls of the attic. From the shadows of the new street outside, things began to emerge, beings that looked like they were made of folded paper and ink stains. The cartographers had come to see their new canvas. Silas bolted for the attic stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. But as he reached the landing, he skidded to a halt. The staircase didn't lead to the second floor. It spiraled downward into a bottomless throat of white, unprinted space. The map on his forearm pulsed. The black ink lines were no longer just a tattoo. They were rising in relief, forming ridges of scar tissue. The street labeled Whistleway on his skin was glowing with a faint, sickly violet light. "This isn't real," Silas hissed, clutching his arm. "It's a hallucination. Chemical. Exposure." "Reality is just a sketch, Silas," a voice whispered. It didn't come from the room. It came from the ink beneath his skin. And sketches can be erased. He turned back toward the attic window, hoping to jump to the garden. But the window showed a landscape that defied physics. Blackwood Falls was no longer a town. It was a folding origami nightmare. Houses were stacked on top of one another at 90-degree angles. The sky was the color of aged parchment, crisscrossed with giant, black meridian lines that hummed with static. Behind him, the paper-thin entities, the cartographers, stepped into the light. They were flat, two-dimensional horrors that crackled like dry vellum when they moved. They had no faces, only symbols where eyes should be: north arrows, scale bars, and compass roses. One of them reached out a hand that looked like a sharpened quill. "The canvas is ready." It vibrated, its voice sounding like paper tearing. "Add the landmark." The ink on Silas's arm suddenly surged. A new icon began to etch itself painfully into his wrist, a small, black house with a smoking chimney. As the icon formed on his skin, the attic floor beneath Silas began to smolder. Real smoke filled the room. The house was reacting to the ink. Silas realized the terrifying truth. He was the master template. Whatever the ink did to his body, the world did to his surroundings. If he scratched his arm, an earthquake would level a street. If he bled, the river would flood. Desperate, Silas grabbed a bottle of industrial solvent from a nearby shelf and poured it over his arm. The ink hissed, but it didn't dissolve. Instead, it screamed. A block away, a real house in Blackwood Falls shrieked as its foundations melted into black sludge. "Stop," Silas cried, dropping the bottle. He looked at his arm. The ink had reached his elbow. It was moving toward his chest, toward his heart. He could see the central cathedral icon beginning to form near his bicep. "I need to leave the map," Silas whispered. He ran toward a door that had appeared where a wall used to be. On the door, a brass plate read, "The drafting room." Beyond it lay not a room, but a vast, infinite desert of white paper, where giant fountain pens fell from the sky like lightning bolts. Silas stepped through the door and into a blinding, featureless white. There was no sun, no sky, and no horizon. Only a vast, flat expanse of heavy-grained paper that stretched forever. Giant fountain pens, the size of redwood trees, were hammered into the ground like lightning rods, their nibs dripping black ichor into the soil. "Don't stand still for too long," a voice warned. "The inkwells are deep, and the white space hates a vacuum." Silas spun around. Emerging from behind a giant, rusted protractor was a woman with hair the color of charcoal. Her clothes were stained with 1,000 different shades of ink, and her fingers were calloused and blackened. "Clara Penhaligon?" Silas gasped. "The report said you disappeared 5 years ago." "I didn't disappear. I was redacted," Clara said, her eyes scanning the shifting lines on Silas's arm. "My father, Arthur, thought he could map the backside of reality. He didn't realize that the world we live in is just the final print. This is the sketchbook. And you, Silas, have become a rough draft." She grabbed his arm, her touch cold and professional. The ink on his bicep was now forming the intricate arches of the central cathedral. "It's moving fast," she muttered. "Once that cathedral reaches your heart, the map will be locked. You'll become the anchor for a new version of Blackwood Falls, one where the cartographers can live, and the humans are just footnotes." "How do I stop it?" Silas winced as a giant pen struck the ground nearby, the impact sounding like a gong. "You can erase it," Clara said, pulling a small, grimy jar from her satchel. "But you can smudge it." She opened the jar. It smelled of turpentine and dead flowers. She dipped a finger into the gray paste and rubbed it over a small dead end, streaked on Silas's forearm. Silas screamed as his skin felt like it was being sandpapered, but on the horizon of the white desert, a massive, jagged mountain range suddenly blurred and collapsed into a flat plain. "You're changing the topography," Clara explained. "By smudging your skin, you're rewriting the path. We need to reach the vanishing point. It's the only place where the ink can be drained back into the void." "Where is it?" Clara pointed toward the center of the white desert, where the lines on the ground converged. But standing in their way were the erasers, hulking, gray-skinned giants with flat, abrasive faces. They didn't have mouths, but they emitted a sound like a heavy rock grinding against bone. "The erasers are here to clean the canvas," Clara whispered, pulling out a sharpened compass. "And to them, Silas, you're just a mistake that needs to be rubbed out." As the first eraser stepped forward, Silas felt his arm grow heavy. The central cathedral on his skin began to rise, the stone towers literally pushing out from his flesh in 3D. The trek across the white paper desert was a nightmare of geometry. Every step Silas took felt less like walking on solid ground, and more like being dragged across a giant whetstone. The central cathedral on his bicep had now fully emerged into a jagged, three-dimensional miniature made of bone-white calcium and black ink. It pulsed in time with his heart, and with every beat, Silas felt his thickness fading. "Clara," Silas wheezed, his voice sounding thin and tinny, like an old gramophone recording. "My hands, I can't feel the grit anymore." He looked down. His fingers were becoming translucent, losing their roundness. They looked like high-resolution drawings of hands rather than actual flesh. "The desert is absorbing your depth," Clara said, her eyes fixed on the horizon where all the black meridian lines met at a single, blinding. "That's the vanishing point. It's the origin of all perspective. If we reach it, We can bleed the ink back into the source. But if you flatten out completely before we get there, you'll just be a silhouette on the floor." Suddenly, the ground groaned. Behind them, the erasers had begun their work. These faceless, gray giants didn't walk. They surged forward, their abrasive skin grinding the white paper into a fine, choking dust. Behind them, the world simply ceased to exist. The sky, the pens, and the paths were being rubbed into nothingness. "They're cleaning the slate," Clara shouted. "Run." They sprinted toward the convergence. As they ran, Silas noticed a change in the ink on his arm. A new name was appearing near his elbow, written in his own father's handwriting. "Penhaligon's Rebade." "Clara, look," Silas cried, showing her his arm. "Your father's name. Why is it on my map?" Clara slowed down for a fraction of a second, her expression flickering between guilt and desperation. "My father didn't just get lost, Silas. He tried to turn himself into a living landmark. He thought if he could etch his soul into the master template, he'd live as long as the town of Blackwood Falls existed. But the cartographers trapped him in a cul-de-sac. He's a ghost street now." Silas felt a surge of cold fury. "You didn't help me because I was in danger. You helped me because my arm is the only way to reach him. I'm a taxi for your dead father. I'm saving both of you," she screamed. Before Silas could respond, a massive eraser loomed over them. It didn't strike with a fist. It leaned its flat, sandpaper face toward Silas's chest. "No!" Clara lunged forward, stabbing her compass into the eraser's eye, a crosshair symbol. The eraser let out a sound like a mountain crumbling, and its form dissolved into gray dust. But the distraction was enough. The ink on Silas's heart began to bloom. The spire of the central cathedral was now inches from his sternum. As they reached the vanishing point, the world around them began to distort. Gravity turned into a literal pull toward the single dot of light. "Jump into the point," Clara yelled. "It will strip the ink. It will strip everything." Silas looked at the light, then at his arm, then at Clara. He realized that if he jumped, the map would be destroyed, but so would the only road that led to Arthur Penhaligon. Silas didn't fall so much as he was folded. As he touched the vanishing point, his body collapsed into a single dimension of light and then expanded with a violent snap. He slammed into a ground that felt like wet cardboard. The air here didn't smell like paper. It smelled like stale ink and forgotten summers. This was the subtown. It was a distorted, monochromatic version of Blackwood Falls. The buildings were held together by giant staples and masking tape. Trees were made of frayed hemp twine, and the sun was a flickering, half-drawn circle in a gray sky. "Silas? Are you solid?" Clara's voice was shaky. She was huddled nearby, her skin looking gray and washed out. Silas looked at his arm. The central cathedral had stopped growing, but it was still there, a heavy, black weight on his heart. The ink on his forearm had shifted again. The ghost street was now a glowing, pulsing line that led directly toward a massive, unfinished tower in the center of the ruins. "I'm solid enough to feel the cold," Silas muttered, shivering. As they moved through the paper scrap streets, they were stopped by a figure sitting on a park bench made of shredded newspapers. He was an old man, but his body was a patchwork of different drawing styles. One arm was a realistic oil painting, the other was a crude charcoal sketch. "Don't go to the tower," the old man croaked. "That's where the architect sits, waiting for a new pen." "Arthur Penhaligon?" Clara stepped forward, her eyes wide. "Is my father in that tower?" The old man laughed, a sound like crinkling parchment. "Arthur didn't get trapped here, girl. He built this place." He realized that the world above was too chaotic, too filled with human error. He wanted a town that followed a perfect design. But the ink has a mind of its own. It's not just paint, it's the blood of the earth. The old man pointed at Silas's arm. He sent that map out like a hook. He needed a fresh body, someone with logic and order, to serve as the new master template. He's not looking for a daughter. He's looking for an upgrade. Silas turned to Clara, his jaw tight. "You knew." You knew he wasn't a victim. I didn't want to believe it, Clara cried. I thought if I brought him a new canvas, he'd come home. I thought he was just lost. He isn't lost, Clara, Silas said, the ink on his heart beginning to burn again. He's hungry. Suddenly, the sky above the subtown began to tear. Giant, black compass spiders, creatures with 8 sharpened drafting legs, began to descend from the ceiling of the world. They were the architect's hounds, sent to retrieve the draft. The cathedral, it's opening, Silas gasped. On his chest, the black ink spire of the cathedral began to physically pierce his skin. A door, no larger than a coin, opened in the ink flesh over his heart. From within Silas's own body, he heard the tolling of a funeral bell. The compass spiders didn't bite, they pinned. Their needle-sharp legs drove into the cardboard ground, trapping Silas's shadow to the floor. As he struggled, the spiders began to reel him in, their silk lines actually being long strands of wet, black typewriter ribbon. Silas, I'm sorry. Clara screamed as she was swept aside by the vibrating legs of a giant arachnid. But Silas couldn't answer. The funeral bell tolling inside his chest was so loud it drowned out his own thoughts. He was dragged into the base of the tower, the central cathedral made manifest. Inside, the architecture was a nightmare of geometry. The walls were lined with millions of tiny pigeonholes, each containing a rolled-up life, a redacted memory, or a discarded street. In the center of the room sat a massive, pulsating machine, the Great Press. It looked like a cross between a printing press and an altar of sacrifice. Suspended above the press was a figure that barely looked human. Arthur Penhaligon was a shimmering, translucent silhouette, his veins filled with flowing ink instead of blood. His face was a shifting blur of sketches. 1 second a stern father, the next a raving madman. Welcome, Silas. Arthur's voice echoed, not from his mouth, but from the ink on Silas's own arm. You have such a linear mind, so orderly, so perfect for the foundation of my new world. You're insane, Silas gasped, the ink spire on his chest now fully protruding, a black obsidian needle pressing against his sternum. You're destroying a real town for a paper fantasy. Real. Arthur laughed, and the sound caused the walls to bleed black ink. The world above is a mess of spilled coffee and torn edges. My Blackwood Falls will be permanent. Every street, a perfect line. Every life, a scripted sentence. And your heart, Silas, your heart will be the pump that keeps the ink flowing through the gutters. The compass spiders lifted Silas and slammed him onto the bed of the Great Press. The heavy iron plate above him began to descend. It was engraved with the final map, the version of the town that would overwrite reality. Clara was right about one thing. Silas gritted his teeth, feeling the weight of the press beginning to crush the air from his lungs. You can't erase the ink, but you can smudge it. Silas realized he couldn't reach the jar of paste Clara had, but he had something else, sweat and blood. He began to thrash, not to escape, but to cause friction. He rubbed his ink-covered arm against the cold iron of the press. He forced his own body heat to rise, trying to turn the permanent ink back into a liquid state. What are you doing? Arthur's silhouette flickered with alarm. You'll ruin the alignment. I'm adding a little. Human error. Silas roared. As his sweat mingled with the ink on his skin, the sharp lines of the central cathedral began to blur. The ghost street on his arm began to run, turning into a messy, chaotic puddle of black. On the bed of the Great Press, the final map started to distort. A park turned into a swamp. A skyscraper melted into a crooked shack. The perfection of Arthur's world was being infected by Silas's biological chaos. The Great Press groaned, its iron gears screaming as they ground against the chaotic, blurred ink Silas had created. By mixing his own biological impurity, sweat, heat, and frantic movement into the master template, Silas had introduced a virus into the architect's perfect code. Suddenly, a sound like a massive dam bursting echoed through the tower. The floor beneath the press buckled, and a geyser of black, Pressurized ink erupted from the foundation. "You've broken the margins," Arthur shrieked. His translucent form began to vibrate so violently that he looked like a flickering television signal. The subtown began to experience an ink-quake. The paper buildings outside the cathedral didn't just shake, they began to bleed and dissolve. The sky parchment tore open, revealing a terrifying, empty void of unwritten space. Silas felt the compass spider's grip loosen as they, too, began to melt into puddles of black oil. He rolled off the press, but as he hit the ground, he realized his body was changing again. He wasn't just flat anymore, he was becoming liquid. His legs were losing their shape, turning into flowing ink trails that merged with the floor. "Silas, grab this." Clara appeared through the black spray, holding a shimmering silver quill. "This is the secret script. My father wrote it before he went mad. It's a deletion command for his own soul. If you can touch him with it, you can rewrite him out of existence. Give it to me." Silas reached out, but his hand was now a shapeless, dark claw. "There's a catch," Clara cried over the roar of the erupting inkwell. "To use it, you have to be part of the map. You'll have to give up your physical body entirely. You won't be Silas Vane, the estate liquidator, anymore. You'll be the new map, the one that keeps this nightmare contained." Arthur Penhaligon, now a towering, monstrous inkblot, lunged toward them. He had absorbed the power of the leaking sun gear of the press. He was no longer a man. He was a Rorschach horror, his shape shifting into the fears of whoever looked at him. I will not be redacted," Arthur roared, his voice a chorus of 1,000 drowned screams. Silas looked at the silver quill, then at his dissolving hands. He saw the Real Blackwood falls through a tear in the reality fabric, people walking their dogs, drinking coffee, completely unaware that their entire world was about to be overwritten by a madman's ink. "I was always a man of coordinates," Silas whispered, his voice now a ripple in the black puddle. "Maybe it's time I became the destination." He plunged his ink-like arm into the silver quill, absorbing its metallic light. He surged forward, not running, but flowing across the floor like a tidal wave of dark lightning toward the heart of the Rorschach horror. Silas didn't collide with Arthur. He absorbed into him. The moment Silas's liquid form touched the Rorschach horror, the tower vanished. He was no longer in the subtown. He was inside the primary archive, Arthur Penhaligon's mind. It was a dizzying, infinite library where the walls were made of skin and the books were written in pulsing veins. Silas held the silver quill, which now glowed like a surgical laser. "Arthur," Silas's voice echoed through the fleshy halls. "It's over. I'm signing your retirement." "You think you are the hero, Silas?" Arthur's voice boomed from the rafters. "Look at the family tree section. Look at your precious Clara." Silas turned to a shelf labeled Project Progeny. He pulled a scroll from the wall. As he unrolled it, his heart, or what was left of it, froze. The scroll contained the blueprints for Clara. It showed her height, her charcoal hair, and even the stains on her fingers. At the bottom, in cold, black ink, was the date of her creation, June 14th, 2019. She isn't real?" Silas gasped. "She is a fictional character." Arthur laughed, his silhouette emerging from the stacks of books. "I needed a bridge to the three-dimensional world. I needed someone you would trust, someone to guide the canvas to the architect. I wrote her to be desperate. I wrote her to be brave. But the moment you delete me with that quill, her ink will dry. She will turn into a static drawing on a piece of scrap paper." Clara stepped into the room, her eyes wet with tears. She looked at the scroll in Silas's hand, then at her own hands. She began to flicker, her outlines becoming shaky and unfinished. "Is it true?" Silas asked, his voice cracking. I remember my childhood, Silas," she whispered, her form fading. "I remember the smell of my mother's perfume. I remember falling off my bike. How can that be a lie?" Backstory, Arthur sneered. "I gave you 1,000 pages of history to make you believable, but you are just a plot device." Arthur lunged at Silas, his ink claws tearing through the library walls. The silver quill in Silas's hand vibrated. He had the power to end it, to strike the signature on the floor and erase Arthur forever. But if he did, Clara would vanish. Choose, Silas. Arthur bellowed. Save the real world and kill the only person who helped you. Or let me finish the press, and we can live in this perfect, scripted eternity together. Silas looked at Clara. She was almost transparent now, her charcoal hair turning into gray pencil lead. She looked at him and smiled, a sad, beautiful smile that felt more real than any coordinate Silas had ever mapped. Do it, Silas, she whispered. I'd rather be a beautiful ending than a never-ending lie. Silas didn't strike the floor. He didn't aim for Arthur's heart. Instead, he turned the silver quill toward his own chest, the place where the central cathedral was still rooted in his ink flesh. I'm not deleting the story, Arthur, Silas roared, his voice vibrating with the power of the silver light. I'm authoring it. Arthur's eyes, two black ink dots, widened in terror. You can't. You're just a canvas. You don't have the authority. I have the ink, Silas countered. Silas plunged the silver quill into his own Heart-Cathedral. He didn't pull it out. He used it like a needle and thread. He began to draw a bridge of shimmering silver ink from his own chest toward Clara's transparent form. He was performing a temporal transfusion. He was pouring his own 3D reality, the memories of his cold, logical life, the weight of his bones, the heat of his blood, into Clara's fictional outline. To make her real, he had to become the fiction. To give her a future, he had to become a map. Silas, no. Clara cried, but as the silver ink touched her, her lines began to solidify. Her charcoal hair gained the scent of real wood smoke. Her skin grew warm. Her eyes turned from ink stains to deep, living brown. As Clara grew heavy with life, Silas began to stretch. His body was pulled thin, becoming wide and flat. His face became a series of elegant, topographical lines. He was no longer a man. He was becoming a living continent. No! Arthur screamed, lunging to break the silver thread. That reality belongs to me. But Silas was faster. With his final ounce of human strength, he reached out and grabbed Arthur's shimmering silhouette. Because Silas was now the new map, he had the power of geography. He didn't kill Arthur. He rerouted him. Silas folded the space around Arthur, turning the architect into a dead-end street. He trapped Arthur in a recursive loop, a small, circular alleyway on Silas's own skin where the architect would walk forever, searching for an exit that didn't exist. The primary archive began to collapse. The fleshy walls dissolved into pure, white light. Clara, Silas's voice was now a whisper carried by the wind. Go back to Blackwood Falls. Live the pages I couldn't. What about you? She sobbed, reaching out to touch him, but her hands only met a smooth, cool surface of ancient vellum. I am the ground you walk on now, Silas whispered. I am the coordinates that keep you safe. I am the Sentinel of the Fold. With a final, blinding flash, the subtown vanished. Clara woke up on the dusty floor of the Penhaligon attic. The air was no longer thick with the scent of ink. It smelled of old paper, autumn leaves, and, for the first time in years, freedom. She gasped, clutching her chest. Her heart beat with a steady, fleshy thud. She looked at her hands. They weren't stained with ink anymore. They were warm, scarred, and undeniably real. She scrambled to her feet and ran to the window. Below her, Blackwood Falls lived. The birds were singing, cars were humming on the asphalt, and the central cathedral was nowhere to be seen, replaced by the familiar, ivy-covered clock tower of the town square. But something was different. Clara looked down at the floor where the cursed map had been. The vellum was still there, but it was no longer a moving nightmare. It was a beautiful, sprawling masterpiece of cartography. At the center of the map, where the town square should be, there was a small, hand-drawn portrait of a man with a steady gaze and a surveyor's compass. Silas Vane. Clara realized that Silas hadn't just saved her. He had become the foundation. He had replaced her father's chaotic, parasitic subtown with his own orderly soul. He was the skeleton beneath the skin of reality, holding the streets in place so they could never be rewritten again. She walked out into the town. As she stepped onto the sidewalk of Main Street, she felt a strange, comforting vibration through the soles of her shoes. It wasn't an earthquake, it was a pulse. Every time she took a step, she felt as if the ground was rising slightly to meet her. The geography of the town seemed to anticipate her needs. When she turned a corner, the streetlights flickered a warm hello. When she felt lost, the signs seemed to tilt just enough to show her the way. Clara moved to a small cottage on the edge of town. On her wall, she framed the map she had brought back from the attic. One evening, years later, Clara sat by the window. She watched a small child trip on the sidewalk outside. Before the child could hit the pavement, the concrete seemed to soften for a split second, and a stray gust of wind pushed the boy back onto his feet. Clara smiled and touched the map on her wall. On the parchment, the dead-end street, where Arthur Penhaligon was trapped, had faded into a tiny, harmless ink blot, a footnote in a much larger story. But the lines representing the town square began to shift. The ink moved slowly, forming two words in the center of the map. Destination reached. Silas was still there, watching over the coordinates of her life. He was the silence between the streets, the logic in the landmarks, and the map that led her home. The world was no longer a rough draft. It was a finished work, signed in the heart of a man who chose to become the world so that one girl could live in it.